Welcome to the Missouri History Museum. My name is David Lobbig, Curator of Environmental Life and author of Mighty Mississippi, the 6,000 square foot exhibit open from November 23, 2019 through June 6, 2021. Mighty Mississippi reconnects us all to the most important river in North America, a river that has made and remade this region time and time again, from its Ice Age origins to today. Drawing primarily from the impressive collections of the Missouri Historical Society, Mighty Mississippi uses more than 200 artifacts, many of which are at least 1,000 years old, to explore how one of the Earth's greatest watersheds has nourished the rise and fall of cultures. Flourishing commerce, tremendous biodiversity, ancient Native American traditions, and abundant fresh water make the Mississippi the most important river in North America. Here at its center, great rivers like the Missouri, Illinois, and Ohio converge, building a vast system on which Native American Mississippian culture, colonial fur trade, and the industrial age each took their turn at causing dramatic change. Mighty Mississippi examines this heritage, providing perspective on our present and future challenges of flooding, pollution, habitat loss, and climate crisis. Sustaining our success depends on the lifeblood of the heartland, the mighty Mississippi River. So join me, please, for closer examination of what is at the core of our community and what makes the heartland of this nation thrive and sustains our lives. There's nothing so striking about the river as its sheer size, the volume of water moving by, especially in flood. The upper Mississippi drains approximately 189,000 square miles at the Missouri-Mississippi confluence. It typically flows at about 195,600 cubic feet per second. Whether sitting on its banks or in its stream, the river changes moods and its enormous power are striking. And the water never dries up. There are times when there's too much water for our towns and cities, but this is the very stream that delivers water for drinking right to our treatment plants, which takes away our treated sewage, which furnishes industry with an essential ingredient to many processes, which is the transportation network for about $164 billion in agricultural products each year. In fact, it is because the Mississippi is a network of streams, not merely a line on the map, that makes it so superlative and diverse. It is the diversity of life supported by the river, its path through the land and its floodplains that makes our lives possible here. There are so many stories about the river, tall but perhaps the most truthful tales penned by Mark Twain, of course, those of explorers like Père Jacques Marquette and Louis Joliet, the river knowledge and ingenuity of James B. Eads and his bridge, and a multitude of others. But none are more interesting to me than those of people who study, care for, and work on the river today. Many voices, over 60 recordings from interviews, are to be heard here. Some, like James Gardner or Terry Beckett, tell of how much pleasure they have in setting channel buoys for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers so that this working river is safe for barges and boats. Others, like the late Missouri Congressman Wayne Good and environmentalist Misa Khan, tell of how important it is and how we can each take care of the river's health and natural biodiversity and keep its waters unpolluted. Stories are to be read in artifacts too, like the gleaming brass microscope of the first St. Louis chemist used to examine contamination and cleanliness of the river's drinking water supply. Or a taxidermy model of a mallard duck, an ID band put on its foot by the second Joseph Pulitzer in 1919 and shot at the river a few years later. With its head slightly cocked, it peers at us from the earliest days of wildlife protection, when it became clear that if we didn't do something quickly, we would lose these water birds and probably all others. In 1918, the Migratory Bird Treaty had been enacted, protecting millions of birds, which used the Mississippi River Flyway each year to move up and down North America to breed and thrive. Or a sonar unit that was of the very first used for civilian purposes after World War II to locate the riverbed, so as to lay electrical supply cables from the generating station on the opposite bank. These are just a few reminders of how the mighty Mississippi is the lifeblood of the heartland. In 1852, river engineer Charles Ellet Jr. reported that confining the Mississippi to a narrow channel caused the water to rise higher and flow faster. Since then, excessive illegal levee construction has turned the upper Mississippi into one of the most endangered rivers in the country. Since 1837, Congress has authorized and funded the Army Corps of Engineers to make harbor and navigation improvements on the Mississippi River. The 1,500 square mile American Bottom floodplain opposite St. Louis was levied from the river's access in the 19th and 20th centuries. As river cities have grown, private and government levees have been built to dry out areas for development. When one area is levied higher or longer, another area can be jeopardized by rising waters. In 2017, almost half of the levees along the 205 miles from central Iowa to St. Louis were above their authorized heights, threatening towns like Hannibal, Louisiana, and LaGrange. Instead of setting levees far enough away from its channel that the river can make use of its floodplain, the river is more often confined, restricted, and so it becomes more unpredictable, sometimes violent. Protecting and restoring the natural river safeguards against future floods and redirects excess water back into the ecosystem, into trees and other plants, and into the soil. Endangered fish, plants, and birds need these intermittently flooded lands to survive. Flooding is also strongly affected by the weather, not just local weather, but also what's happening upstream. The 2018 National Climate Assessment projects that both flooding and droughts will be more severe, more frequent, and more devastating as the atmosphere warms. Nearly all of the floods since 1993's record-breaking flood have been off the charts. Based on a gauge from the St. Louis Harbor Master's Office, this graphic shows that the majority of St. Louis's most severe floods have been recent ones. The 1993 flood would be 4 feet higher than the June 2019 flood recorded at the top. But stated simply, put anything in a river's floodplain and water is bound to run over it sooner or later. Millions of pounds of industrial waste sit quietly in confluence area floodplains, some of it disturbingly hazardous. Beginning in 1943, regional companies took on major roles in nuclear weapons development. Radioactive waste was left near the Mississippi and Missouri rivers upstream from municipal water intakes, and some of it was flushed into tributaries and groundwater as early as the 1960s. If climate model predictions prove accurate, the river could reclaim those floodplains in 50 to 100 years. More frequent flooding and extreme weather events will likely risk waste exposure for the area's 2.85 million people. Here we are in the First Peoples world. Although no one knows what they called themselves, we now call them the Mississippians. They were members of a vast Native American culture that extended from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, from Oklahoma to today's southeastern states. Of all the First Peoples in North America, the people who would develop the Mississippian way of life made particularly good use of the river's rich, fertile soils for plant cultivation, about 1,200 years ago. This enabled them to dramatically increase their population, build large towns, and expand and attract others to their culture for over thousands of miles along North America's river system. These were the mound builders, so called because their settlements typically featured a variety of earthen mounds. Their cultural center was a complex of communities and sites located at present-day Cahokia Mound State Park, St. Louis, and East St. Louis. People of the Mississippian period knew their water world very well. The wetlands and tributaries of the Mississippi River provided some of the greatest diversity of plants and animals in the world, a bounty for food, clothing, shelter, and tools. Utilitarian and decorative objects were crafted to represent animal life of this river world. Pottery, bottles, bowls, and jars often took the form of specific fish, birds, and mammals. There's a lot we don't know about many of these objects, but looking at the context in which they were found and comparing to those used by more recent Native Americans, ceremony was surely central. Bones, shells, feathers, and other parts of river creatures had aesthetic and ritual purposes, in addition to practical applications. The wet, fertile river bottoms were an important initial resource for their cultivation of food. Stone hoes and shovels attest to this. These fascinating and accomplished people did so much. We would recognize them today as a very advanced civilization, much like our own. Their most important complex of communities, their metropolitan area, thriving at the central confluence region of the great rivers, radiating outward among the many tributaries. Even here, not too far away in Forest Park, there were once 20 earthen mounds along the River des Peres. Canoes brought in resources that were not native to the central region. But in the 1200s, the Mississippians' civilization met a series of climate, resource, and undoubtedly some kind of social disasters, and their river world began to collapse. In the 1600s, warring European adversaries brought their competition to the Mississippi River. The origins and extent of the river were then unknown to them, but it was thought to be a westward route to the Pacific Ocean and the lucrative Chinese trade. Neither this path nor the gold and silver they sought were to be found, but the Mississippi and its vital Missouri River tributary proved to be a conduit through which valuable animal furs and minerals like lead could be exported to home countries. Just like the Mississippian people about 400 years earlier, Europeans used the river's branching network of streams, introducing flatboats and keelboats for their greater capacity than canoes. Moving deep into the North American interior, natural resources became targets for imperial and commercial conquest. St. Louis traders were at the heart of the Missouri and Mississippi River trade, including innovators like Manuel Lisa, the Missouri Fur Company and the Rocky Mountain Fur Company. John Jacob Astor's American Fur Company came to dominate the Missouri River and Rocky Mountain trade after he partnered with the Choteau family of St. Louis. Of course, the First Peoples had already been present for thousands of years. Their intimate relationship with the river and its ancestral lands was challenged and upended as new ideas, technologies, and societal pressures were introduced. For the most part, Native Americans engaged in trade on their own terms, while newcomers had to respect indigenous customs. European goods were made from durable, attractive materials and could provide comfort and convenience. Copper was cherished for its appearance and malleability, so cooking kettles like this were especially popular trade items as early as the 1500s. Easy to repair and transport, this type has been found at 18th century sites along the Missouri and Mississippi rivers. One of many types of iron products, the Missouri war axe was prized by the Osage and others along the Missouri River, which gave it its name. Good for more than chopping wood, it was a symbol of power and authority, a weapon to be admired for its elegance, displaying the blacksmith's skill in forging iron. Many other products, like glass beads, cloth, and guns, were shipped to and traded on the river system and across North America. After the Louisiana Purchase, the United States government began organizing the territory for increased settlement and ownership of land west of the Mississippi River. William Clark, of Corps of Discovery fame, remained in St. Louis after 1806, becoming the Missouri Territory Governor from 1813 to 1820, and Superintendent of Indian Affairs in St. Louis from 1822 until his death in 1838. Clark supervised the removal of tribes east of and around the Mississippi River, directing their resettlement in what is now eastern Kansas, personally overseeing the expulsion of Native Americans from 100 million acres of land. The Industrial Age chugged into the lower Mississippi River in 1811 with the arrival of the steamboat New Orleans. Within about 25 years, hundreds of boats landed at and departed from St. Louis every day. These boats pushed farther into the frontier. First used to supply the fur trade, they eventually brought hundreds of thousands of new immigrants into land once dotted with only tiny colonial settlements. For an entire generation, steamboats were the main way to travel in the western United States. Steam power revolutionized commerce and immigration in the West. Once an outpost, St. Louis became a thriving community, poised at the confluence of two important rivers. St. Louis and other cities along the Mississippi were home to booming populations, innovation, and entrepreneurship. The resources of the river region were exploited to serve the new culture, setting the stage for threats and challenges to the river and the communities that depended on it. Steamboat owners often operated several boats and invested in industrial production and importation of goods. Just as the economy of cities like St. Louis expanded, river commerce made some businessmen and their families very wealthy. Before the Civil War, Enslaved African Americans made up a significant portion of the labor force in slave states like Missouri. Steamboats that transported tobacco, hemp, and cotton and other crops and goods to the port of New Orleans also shipped enslaved Missourians to large southern plantations. Both free and slave states benefited economically from the exploitation of enslaved and free black people. In the busiest days of steamboat transportation, cabin passage was a luxury few could afford. Upper deck cabins provided private sleeping quarters and wash basins, and passengers were served meals in a dining hall and saloon lounge area decorated with elaborate chandeliers, wallpaper, and carpeting. Cabins and lounges were furnished with the comforts of first-class hotels, including carved furniture and striking architecture. Meanwhile, most people booked cheaper tickets next to the loud engines. They traveled among livestock and bulk dry goods, and they were first in the water if the boat sank. They were subject to infectious diseases like cholera and yellow fever, spread easily among the passengers and transmitted into new communities where they landed. Lacking a sewer system, the booming St. Louis population of 75,000 was hardest hit in 1849 when more than 4,500 people died of cholera. Many types of steamboats were used on the Mississippi and its tributaries, but most of them were packet boats. Packet boats transported packets or packages of cargo such as mail, bales of cotton, barrels of salt pork, or crates of manufactured goods. And they took on passengers when there was room. Now, this remarkable survivor is the Golden Eagle pilot house as it was in about 1930. This amazing artifact is one of the largest in the MHS collections, certainly the largest in this exhibit, and was the uppermost deck of the last wood-hulled packet boat on the Mississippi River. When the steamer William Garrig was built in 1904 by the famous Howard Boat Company of Jeffersonville, Indiana, packet boats had given way to rail transportation. But the boat, originally designed for the lower Mississippi cotton trade, remained a successful icon of the steamboat era for 43 years. It continued as a packet after it was bought in 1918 by the Eagle Packet Company, which had to rebuild after its entire fleet was crushed by ice. The 175 by 35-foot boat was refurbished in Carondelet Marine in St. Louis and was rechristened Golden Eagle. It operated on the Mississippi and Illinois rivers until 1935, when it was converted to overnight passenger excursions from St. Paul to the Tennessee River. Sold in 1946, the Golden Eagle was refurbished again, but sank at Grand Tower during its maiden run in 1947. Pilot houses were the control center for movement of the steamboat on the river. The pilot's ability to read the river was essential to safe passage. The pilot communicated with the engine room, steered the boat, and set its speed. Crew members were directed from the pilot house to secure the boat in port and to cast away for travel. The pilot wheel was used to operate two tillers in the aft or back of the boat. The long boat was steered while keeping the tall jackstaff at the fore or front of the boat, targeting the intended direction. Brake pedals helped to slow or stop a turning wheel. The tiller handles in this pilot house were added later to replace the wheel's function. A rope pulled the stopping and starting bell on the main deck to ring in the engine room. Depending on the bell sequence, the engineer was signaled to throttle, stop, or open up the engines. A backing gong was sounded in the engine room to reverse engines. A speaking tube could be used to communicate with the engineer, but the distance and roar of the engines sometimes made this difficult. The deck bell, used to signal landing and departure, was pulled by a rope leading to the fore of the boat. Other ropes from the pilot house operated a searchlight. Whistles were blown by using pedals on the floor. Their duration and sequence alerted vessels to the boat's position or the pilot's intentions to move, and they alerted crew members to emergencies. Extensively conserved and restored, this pilot house is a very rare and important icon of the steamboat era and America's industrial age. Our communities thrive here at the Mississippi's confluence with its formidable, beautiful tributary, the Missouri. But we must be good stewards of river health for civilization to survive. Thank you for joining me on this tour in appreciation of one of the world's greatest river systems. Explore more about the communities this magnificent river has built at the Missouri History Museum in St. Louis's Forest Park. Dive into history of our Great Western rivers archived at the Missouri Historical Society's Library and Research Center at 225 South Skinker Boulevard on the west side of the park. And find more interviews and programs about the mighty Mississippi online at mohistory.org. The exhibit remains open at the Missouri History Museum through June 6, 2021. Admission is free, but advance registration is required. Bank of America is the presenting sponsor with additional support provided by JSM Charitable Trust.